France. May 1940. The first German units cross the Meuse River on the 13th. Paris falls on the 14th of June. By the 22nd, France has signed an armistice in a railway car in the forest of Compiègne. From the first crossing to the ceasefire, 6 weeks. In the First World War, Germany fought France for 4 years and 4 months. It failed. The question is not why Germany won in 1940. The question is how Germany built an army capable of winning, because legally it could not have one. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles had stripped Germany of its air force, its tanks, its heavy artillery, its submarines, and its general staff. It had capped the army at 100,000 men. Every weapon that crossed into France in 1940 was forbidden, and every pilot in every cockpit had trained in a program that didn't officially exist. The men commanding the panzer divisions had studied their craft in a country that was supposed to be Germany's ideological opposite, wearing uniforms that weren't theirs. The standard explanation is that Germany broke the rules. That's true. But it's not the interesting part. The interesting part is this. The rules were written by the people who had just won the First World War at the absolute height of their power, with every incentive to get this right. And they didn't just fail to stop Germany. Through a sequence of specific, traceable miscalculations, they helped build it. This is how that happened. June 28, 1919. Versailles, the Hall of Mirrors. The same room where Germany had proclaimed its empire 48 years earlier. And now German delegates sign in silence while Allied representatives watch. The architects of the peace believe they have solved the German problem permanently. The military provisions of the treaty are comprehensive. Germany's army is kept at 100,000 men and 4,000 officers. No general staff, no air force, no tanks, no heavy artillery, no submarines. The Great War's weapon systems, the ones that had killed millions, are stripped away by name. 3 military academies, 1 per branch of service, are all that remains of the training apparatus. Conscription is abolished, and here, in one particular clause, the drafters are especially satisfied. Private soldiers and non-commissioned officers must serve a minimum of 12 years. Officers, 25. The logic is clean. And if Germany cannot cycle men rapidly through the army, it cannot build a hidden reserve. The 12-year minimum holds trained soldiers inside the system, unavailable to disperse through civilian society and wait to be recalled. A nation with no trained reserve cannot quickly field a mass army. The cage is closed. The Inter-Allied Military Control Commission is established to enforce it. Over 300 inspections between 1920 and 1927. Any violation becomes a diplomatic incident. The Allies have thought of everything. Hans von Seeckt reads the Versailles terms in 1919 and is furious. He does not hide this. In a memo circulated within the officer corps. Not a private letter, a document written for colleagues to read. He lays out his position precisely. He writes of the day fate will again call Germany to arms. Sagan declares that the duty of the officer corps is to ensure that day finds the nation ready. The army will survive. The next war is coming. This is not a man concealing his intentions. Seeckt is 53 when he takes command of the Reichswehr. He is slender, erect, cold in manner, a monocle frequently in place, a general's composure with nothing theatrical about it, only the complete absence of pretense. He had been the real author of Germany's mobile victories on the Eastern Front in the Great War. He had watched cavalry and infantry move fast and hit hard while the Western Front ground men to pulp. He understood, better than almost anyone in Europe, what mobile warfare could achieve. He intends to build an army that can do it again. The treaty gives him 100,000 men and 4,000 officers. He accepts the numbers, but he will use them differently than anyone expects. The Allies believed reducing the officer corps from 60,000 to 4,000 would cripple German military leadership. Seeckt uses the reduction as a selection. He keeps only the finest officers in Germany. Every man retained is a man who can think above his rank. A captain trained to function as a colonel. A colonel trained to think like a general. The cadre concept, not an army built to fight at its present size, but a skeleton army built to expand the moment the restrictions lift. 100,000 men who can each command 10 times their number. And then the 12-year service minimum, the provision the Allies designed to prevent a trained reserve, does something its authors never considered. It holds the best officers inside one institution for a decade. And they don't leave. They stay, study, teach, and refine. The clause meant to freeze Germany's military development instead concentrates its military brain trust in one place for 10 consecutive years of doctrinal work. Seeckt finds the next gap almost immediately. The treaty limits officers. It says nothing about non-commissioned officers. He restructures the Reichswehr so that more than half the force is composed of NCOs trained for officer roles. Thinking at officer level, holding officer knowledge inside a rank the treaty never thought to restrict. A mass reserve of junior leaders hides in plain sight inside a technically compliant army, inside the legal structure of the very treaty meant to prevent exactly this. The general staff, specifically named, specifically ordered, dissolved, becomes the Truppenamt, the troop office. On paper, personnel administration. A grey building in Berlin, officers in understated Feldgrau bent over what appear to be routine records. When commission inspectors arrive, the maps disappear. The meetings shift to administrative reviews. The inspectors find nothing wrong. The Truppenamt is the brain of a future war machine operating from inside a Versailles-compliant address on a Berlin street. Then the doctrine. In 1919, while every other major power sorts its Great War stockpile and argues over what equipment to keep, Seeckt commissions 57 committees to study the last war while its lessons are still fresh. Every engagement, every innovation, every mistake. In 1921, the committees produced their result. Leadership and battle with combined arms. The conceptual DNA of what the world will later call Blitzkrieg. Mobile, fast, combined arms built around initiative and penetration rather than attrition. Germany does not have a single tank when this doctrine is written. It doesn't need one yet. The doctrine comes first, and Germany is free to build doctrine from nothing because the Versailles Treaty stripped away every piece of legacy hardware that would have constrained its thinking. Britain and France are building doctrine around the weapons they already have. Germany is building doctrine around the war it intends to fight. The weapons will be designed to match the concept. The provision that banned Germany's Great War stockpile had, without intending to, freed German military thinking from the weight of it. Seeckt's methods are institutional and precise. Alongside them, beyond them, something darker runs in parallel. And the Black Reichswehr is what it sounds like. Clandestine paramilitary formations, drawn from Freikorps veterans who never psychologically demobilized, organized inside units disguised as labor battalions and border security organizations. By 1923, during the French occupation of the Ruhr, they swelled to an estimated 50,000 to 80,000 personnel, funded through indirect Reichswehr allocations and private nationalist contributions. Officially non-existent. The commission inspectors find paperwork. They find organizations that look on the forms, like construction crews. The real organization is behind the paperwork. It is not a clean operation. The Black Reichswehr murders perceived informants. At least 354 confirmed cases between 1919 and 1923. Men killed by secret internal tribunals, see their deaths buried alongside everything else the organization was hiding. Meanwhile, German companies are moving. The treaty forbids weapons production inside Germany. It says nothing about outside. Krupp acquires Bofors in Sweden. German firms establish operations in the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Sweden. German soldiers travel to Sweden to test artillery. By 1925, more than half of China's arms imports are German, not because Germany is selling to China out of commercial interest, but because Germany is researching through China. The weapons find a market, the research finds a cover. The Weimar Republic's civilian government, the Democratic Republic the Allies recognized, engaged with, and extended credit to, funds all of it. Hidden in what became known as X-budgets, up to 10% above the disclosed military budget, concealed in accounts that made no mention of weapons. The government knew. The foreign ministry knew. The finance ministry knew. The standard story of Weimar innocence and Nazi criminality is incomplete. The Republic armed. In 1927, the Inter-Allied Military Control Commission withdraws. Citing German obstruction, they believe the major violations have been identified and contained. They have no idea of the full shape of what they were never shown. The inspectors leave. The cage, which had stopped being a cage years earlier, now has no lock at all. The year is 1922. In the Italian resort town of Rapallo, while the Western powers believe they have Germany seated politely at a conference table in nearby Genoa, German Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau and Soviet envoy Georgy Shikharin meet separately. So what they agree to surprises international diplomacy. What they don't tell anyone is deeper than the agreement on paper. Two nations, both pariahs. Germany, hemmed in and humiliated by Versailles. Soviet Russia, diplomatically isolated by a West that refuses to recognize the Bolshevik government. Two states with everything to gain from each other's company. France, when it hears about Rapallo, speaks of betrayal. It has no idea. Germany needs territory. Territory to train with weapons it is forbidden to possess, far from commission inspectors, far from diplomatic observers. The Soviet Union needs something else. German technical expertise, industrial contracts, modern military knowledge transferred into Red Army training programs. In the 1920s alone, the Red Army will negotiate contracts with 255 German companies, including nearly every major industrial firm in the country. Neither side trusts the other. Both sides need the deal. The first school opens at Lipetsk, in the Russian steppe, roughly 400 kilometers south of Moscow. April 1925. A contract is signed. The following year, German personnel begin arriving. They travel in civilian clothes. On the Soviet airfield, they fly Dutch Fokker fighters with national markings deliberately omitted. They speak German only in private. In an average summer, there are 140 Germans on site, the compound shrinking to 40 in winter. 4 million Reichsmarks per year, drawn from the same hidden accounts that fund everything else. When the school closes in 1933, it has trained 120 fighter pilots, 300 ground personnel, and 450 instructors and administrative staff. The seed population of an air force that officially does not exist. 22 of the men who study, teach, or command at Lipetsk will become Luftwaffe generals of 3-star rank or above. All but one of Germany's aircraft design firms secretly dispatch prototypes there for testing. The aircraft that will bomb London, the pilots who will fly them, the designers who will build the next generation. Their professional origins run through a Soviet airfield they were never supposed to have been on. 3 years after Lipetsk opens, a second facility begins operations near Kazan on the Volga. The Kama Tank School. Engineers from Daimler, Krupp, Rheinmetall, and MAN arrive with tank prototypes disguised as agricultural machinery, crated, transferred by rail without customs inspection. The school begins formal operations in October 1929. The German officers who come to Kama do not wear German uniforms. Civilian clothes where possible, borrowed Soviet uniforms when necessary. On the flat steppe terrain around Kazan, German officers in Soviet dress run exercises alongside Soviet tank officers, testing prototypes, refining specifications, building operational doctrine for an armored force that does not yet have a country. The designs proven here become the Panzer Mark I, II, III, and IV, Germany's main battle tanks through 1943. The communications technology developed here, the radio that can function reliably inside a moving tank, the capability that makes coordinated armored operations possible, is refined on this ground. Yet among the men who visit and train at Kama, Werner von Blomberg, Walter Model, Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, and a compact, energetic officer named Heinz Guderian, who arrives in 1929, watches prototype tanks run across the steppe and carries what he sees back to his work on armored doctrine. Work that will eventually produce the panzer divisions themselves. 17 of the men who pass through Kama will command at least a division in combat in the Second World War. German officers in Soviet uniforms, on Soviet soil, learning to fight armored battles with tanks their country is not permitted to possess. That is the arrangement, stated plainly. A third facility, at Tomka in the Saratov region, runs from 1928 to 1931. 25 permanent German personnel, 4 laboratories, chemical weapons. And its significance is not strategic, it is tonal. There were no limits on what was being built in Russia. In 1928, Soviet envoy Nikolai Krestinsky writes to Stalin about the arrangement. He is reassuring. The Germans are the ones violating the Treaty of Versailles, he explains, and therefore it is the Germans who need to fear exposure and maintain secrecy. The Soviets hold all the leverage. His assessment is reasonable. The Germans are in violation. The arrangement favors Moscow. January 30th, 1933. Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. He wants an army. He wants it massive, and he wants it immediately, and he will not permit it to cause inflation. The shadow of 1923, when the mark hit 4 trillion to the dollar and wheelbarrows of currency bought a loaf of bread, is the one thing that could collapse his political project before it begins. He hands the problem to Hjalmar Schacht. Schacht is the man who stabilized the German mark after the 1923 catastrophe. He is tall, severe, with a stiff wing collar that looks 2 decades out of date and pale eyes that miss very little. He speaks 5 languages and moves through international banking circles with practiced ease. He is not a Nazi ideologue. He's a technician. He believes in Germany's recovery, and he is the most capable financial mind in the country. The problem before him is precise. The rearmament program Hitler wants requires spending that exceeds Germany's entire national debt, and so it must leave no paper trail that foreign governments could use as evidence. It must not trigger inflation. And legally, the Reichsbank can lend the government only 100 million Reichsmarks directly, a sum that would not cover a single division. Schacht's solution is a company called Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, Mefo. 4 shareholders, Krupp, Siemens, Gute Hoffnungshütte, and Rheinmetall. 2 directors, one appointed by the Reich Ministry of Defense, one by the Reichsbank. No product, no operation, no address that means anything. It exists as a balance sheet and nothing more. Here is how it works. A factory receives an order to build tanks. Instead of cash, it receives Mefo bills, drawn on the Mefo company, guaranteed by the Reich. The factory takes those bills to a German bank. The bank converts them to cash, and then takes the bills to the Reichsbank, which honors them through its money-issuing powers. At no point does a line item marked tanks appear in any public document. The Reichsbank is lending money to the government through a route that bypasses every legal restriction on direct lending. Schacht himself will later say, at Nuremberg, that the Mefo device enabled the Reichsbank to lend by subterfuge to the government what it normally or legally could not do. The word subterfuge is his. He chose it himself. Between 1934 and 1938, 12 billion Reichsmarks in Mefo bills are issued. Germany's entire national debt in 1932 was 10 billion Reichsmarks. By 1938, the official debt stands at 19 billion, but the 12 billion in Mefo bills sits on top of that, invisible to any public accounting. That more than half the increase in Germany's national debt over 6 years is off the books. 60% of gross military expenditure financed with paper that officially did not exist. The bills are structured to prevent redemption. They carry 4% interest, enough to make holding them attractive. And their maturity is extended in rolling 90-day increments, keeping them circulating as a shadow currency among industrial firms rather than being cashed out. As long as the firms keep rolling them over, no inflationary pressure builds. The system is elegant. It holds. Until 1938, when the bills begin to mature in quantities the finance ministry cannot honor, the solution is not elegant. Banks are compelled to buy government bonds to cover the payments. Funds are drawn from insurance company reserves. The personal savings accounts are quietly requisitioned. Ordinary German citizens, people who have spent the 1930s saving for retirement, become, without their knowledge and without their consent, the final financiers of the rearmament that was hidden from them. The panzer divisions rolling across Europe are built, in part, on savings accounts belonging to people who were never told. Seeckt resigns in January 1939. He built the machine. Germany is 8 months from invading Poland. August 2nd, 1934. Paul von Hindenburg dies at his estate in East Prussia. Within hours, Reich Minister of War Werner von Blomberg administers a new oath to the Reichswehr. Under Weimar, soldiers swore to the Constitution, to the state, to the law. The new oath is personal. It names one man, Adolf Hitler, and every officer Seeckt, selected and kept through a decade of institutional refinement. Every NCO trained above his rank. Every man who flew out of Lipetsk or tested tanks at Kama or sat in the building on the Berlin street that called itself the Troop Office. All of them in a single administrative ceremony on a single morning become the personal instrument of one man. Not Germany. One man. Seeckt had built a professional army designed to serve the German state. It takes one paragraph, read aloud, to transfer it. He is in China when it happens, advising Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces. Still useful, just not to the country he spent his life serving. March 16th, 1935. Berlin. Hitler announces conscription publicly from a packed Reichstag chamber. Above the city, the Luftwaffe reveals itself. Aircraft designed at Lipetsk, flown by men trained in Russia, paid for with bills drawn on a company with no address. In formation overhead. Crowds gather. Newsreel cameras record. For years, the official German position had been that its aviation development was purely civilian, purely commercial. Now it is in the sky above the capital. The response of the Western powers is, essentially, nothing. A year later, March the 7th, 1936. German infantry march into the Rhineland. The buffer zone Versailles had placed between Germany and France, demilitarized, forbidden to German troops. Most German generals had opposed the order. They were right to be afraid. German forces have instructions to withdraw immediately if France moves against them. France does not move. Britain protests. The League of Nations convenes. Germany stays. Hitler draws his lesson. Now the democracies will not fight for the provisions of a treaty. He will test this carefully and then less carefully until September 1939. June 22nd, 1941. Germany invades the Soviet Union. The panzer commanders leading the armored spearheads include men who came to Kazan in the late 1920s, who wore Soviet uniforms in the Soviet steppe, who tested the prototypes that became the tanks now crossing this border. On the other side, the Soviet industrial capacity that German firms helped construct in the 1920s, 55% of Soviet tank production dependent on factories built with German industrial assistance, is the enemy's war economy. The Soviets helped train the officers now commanding the force aimed at them. The Soviets helped build the factories now targeted by that force. Krestinsky's letter sits in an archive somewhere, confident and composed. The Germans, he had written, were the ones who needed to fear exposure. Both sides were right that they were using the other. Neither side could see what using the other would produce. Hans von Seeckt died in Berlin on December 27, 1936. He was 69 years old. The year before, he had come home from China in failing health. Still the indispensable expert, just for a foreign government rather than his own. His final months in Berlin were filled with Nazi ceremony and tribute from the leaders of the regime now controlling the army he had built, honoring a man they had inherited rather than made. He never saw France fall in 6 weeks. He never saw the panzers cross the Soviet border. He wrote the doctrine, assembled the cadre, exploited the loopholes, turned the treaty's restrictions into instruments of refinement, and handed the result, intact, primed and aimed, to men who used it in ways he could not have predicted. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28, 1919. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. 20 years, 2 months, and 4 days.